Yes, morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Aradhna Malhotra Oliphant, and I'm privileged to work for Cine and Wallis and to serve as the Chief Operations and Strategy Officer for the Wallis Annenberg Legacy Foundation. Thank you to our partners at the Wilshire Boulevard Temple, whose home we are in. So thank you, Elizabeth and your team, for making all of this work. A round of applause, please. Thank you. And thank you, Michael, for making me sound, at least there you go. All right, I take the thanks back, Michael. I take the thanks back. Okay. You are here early in the morning, navigating LA traffic for an important discussion on intergenerational ties in a world beset by ageism and how these ties are formed in the LGBTQ plus community. So this is going to be an exciting, interesting, hopefully challenging conversation. So I'm putting the panelists on notice. As many of you know, Wallis Annenberg and the Wallis Annenberg Legacy Foundation are deeply committed to intergenerational connectivity and healthy aging and a fuller experience of the human spirit. And as a part of that, Wallis and Cindy Kennard, who's the executive director of the Annenberg Foundation, helped create the space one floor above here, right, Amber? One floor above here called the Wallis Annenberg Gen Space. And please do save at least 10 minutes if you can at the end of this fabulous program. Come visit us, come feel the energy there. It'll knock your socks off. We were and are very pleased to join the David Bohnett Foundation in partnering with SAGE and Stanford's Longevity Project to make this morning's event possible. Congratulations to Ken Stern and Michael, and a round of applause, please, for getting us out of our beds and here for an 8 o'clock show. Thank you. Thank you for your partnership with us. So we will begin the framing conversation, the morning, with a framing conversation between Michael Adams, CEO of SAGE, and Eunice Lin-Nichols, co-CEO of CoGenerate, another one of the Wallis Annenberg Legacy Foundation partners. And this conversation would be on ageism, building ties across generations, and what we can do to overcome ageism. I am at that age now that I'm encountering it more and more and more, so I'm trusting my future to you and that conversation. Following that, Ken Stern, founder and chair of the Longevity Project, a long-standing partner with the Annenberg Foundation, and it was the research conducted by and at Stanford that helped shape Gen Space. Ken will lead the panel discussion on intergenerational ties in the LGBTQ community. Thank you for coming. There will be coffee, and there are some snacks outside. Thank you for coming. Good morning, and over to you.
Okay. Well, it is great to see everybody. I hope you all brought your sunglasses. I see some of you did. We are super, super excited to kick off this program tomorrow. And thank you to the Wallis Annenberg Legacy Fund and to the David Bohnett Foundation for supporting us here today. So, Eunice, let's get started. We have the job, the responsibility of trying to frame the conversation that will follow. So we're about to have in a few minutes, a amazing panel conversation that brings in various perspectives on intergenerational issues, ageism, from LGBTQ plus community experiences. In thinking about today, I was thinking about what this means for an organization like SAGE. We were started 46 years ago, and and our focus has always been improving the quality of life of LGBTQ plus older folks. And from the beginning, there has been something always that has been really important about generations. Because what we've seen historically in work with tens of thousands of queer elders over many years is that one of the major pain points that so many older folks in our community have is the lack of ties with younger generations. And part of that is practical. Who is going to take care of me and support me when I age if I need help, because most of us don't have kids and don't have some of the infrastructure, et cetera. But some of it's also psychic. This sense of among our elders who created the community that we're in, who led the civil rights struggles and the human rights struggles for our community, this hurt that folks can feel if they believe that young people don't recognize those contributions, and don't honor them, right? So this is why building ties across generation has been and is a really strategic and important priority for SAGE, and has been for many years. So that's a little bit what we bring to the conversation. But talk to us about CoGenerate. You're the co-CEO of CoGenerate. Why was CoGenerate founded to focus on these issues? And what's the passion that you bring to this conversation about intergenerational ties and strategies?
I appreciate that so much. I'm very pleased to be here. It's my first time in the Gen space. So thank you, Annenberg Foundation, and just pleased to be here and to be here with you, Michael. So my pathway in, I'm the daughter of immigrants from Taiwan. Like many immigrants before me, when my parents got settled in the Midwest, they brought their parents over. So I lived in an intergenerational household in my early years. And that's what I thought was the norm. And it really wasn't until I left for college and then in my early career where society kind of funneled me into a structure that was all young people. And in some ways that was kind of exciting. I felt like I had left my extended family and was trying to pursue the American dream. And it wasn't until a few years out of college that I realized I felt really disconnected from community. And probably only in retrospect do I look back and understand that some of that deep sense of disconnection was because I was no longer connected to a really robust and dynamic extended community that included elders. It launched me on what has become my career path and my passion. Maybe some would call it an obsession. CoGenerate's focus is to connect older and younger generations to bridge divides and co-create a better future. And we're really interested in the with. So much of our work actually in the first 20 years of our organization's history was focused, rightfully so, on what older adults can and should do for young people. There's so much experience and talent and opportunity to give from older generations, often kind of siloed from young people. But as we dug into that body of work, increasingly we were seeing that older adults, as they were engaging with young people, also were getting so much. It was very rare to have elders working with young people who didn't say, I think I'm getting more from young people than they might be getting from me. As we dug more into that, we actually changed our name from encore.org to CoGenerate a little more than 2 years ago, just to double down on the with. And so much of our work now is energized by sort of a new vision for us on how do we bring these two different groups together. I was kind of say hats off to the Stanford Center for Longevity and some research that they've put out that we've tracked very closely around the shifting age demographics. And the fact that since the early 1900s, our society looked much like other societies have for a very long time, with half of the population under 20 years old, and then each generation subsequently fewer people. So it's sort of a triangle, as you'd expect. But today, if you look at the age demographics of America, we actually have the same numbers of people every age to 70 and beyond. And so that demographic chart now looks like a rectangle. And if you think about what that means for the institutions and for society and for communities, it's really astounding because we're not structured for an incredibly age-diverse society. So we often ask ourselves the question, what would society look like if it were built for a 100-year life? Probably not the society we have right now. So we're eager to lean into the innovations, the new stories that need to be told about that, as well as the opportunity to take what has become a really age-siloed society and kind of bring the puzzle pieces back together.
That's fantastic. That's great. It's a great way to then kick us off. So let's talk about ageism. And you know, in the world and community in which I exist and spend so much time in and do so much work in the LGBTQ plus communities, there's a rap. There's a rap about ageism. There's a notion that ageism is very prevalent in our community, perhaps even more prevalent than in society in general. We hear various theories about this. Theories like the fact that our historical struggle as a community is intertwined with our sexuality, and that so often sexuality is typecast as being about youth, or notions of there being a strong emphasis on youth and virility within certain parts of the gay male community, perhaps as an antidote to historical othering of gay men. So there are all kinds of different notions of the challenges and the barriers that ageism may present in LGBTQ plus communities, and yet our experience at SAGE in some ways is quite different, which is we often see a great deal of interest among younger folks in older members of the community. Whenever we have intergenerational programs, volunteer activities, we are really overrun with young people who are interested in having those connections with older people in the community, in embracing their history, embracing the contributions of their elders. So often what we see in our work seems to be very different from this notion that ageism is rampant in the community for all of these different reasons. So it makes us feel as though that ageism and the barriers it presents maybe are more nuanced than we sometimes think. So I wanted to ask you, talk to us a little bit about, to what degree is ageism a barrier to building ties across generations? And I wonder if does it manifest, do you think, in ways that are consistent and universal across communities that in some ways are different based on lived experience, different based on cultural identity? Does it look the same, do you think, in different communities, or might there be particular permutations and differences and challenges and opportunities in different communities based on history, lived experience, and culture?
Yeah, I would say, ageism is real. And I think often, depending on where you're situated in society, we either focus on the toll of ageism for older folks. If you work at all with youth, you'll hear youth say they feel like they're also experiencing ageism. Both generations told that they are too old or too young to do something. In some ways, siloed off by society into, there are places that young people go and learn and hang out, and there are places that older folks do that. We at CoGenerate, we get really interested when their olders and youngers are experiencing, in some ways, the same thing, but it's manifesting in different ways. And then we ask, how might we bring these pieces together? How might they actually solve each other's challenges? We actually did 2 years ago a survey with the University of Chicago and their National Opinion Research Center to ask this question: Do older and younger people actually want to connect across generations? Do they think that intergenerational connection and collaboration is a good idea? Will it solve some of America's biggest problems? We actually did not know what the survey results would say, but the data actually is very much, as you suggested, Michael, that there's a predominant narrative in our country that older and younger cannot get along, that there's just generational strife and a zero-sum game. The survey that we put out actually, it was almost not interesting because 97%, almost everybody of all generations, of all ages said it's a good idea. We think it will make society better. We should do more of it. One interesting piece was that even though everybody said it was a good idea, young people actually said they wanted it even more than any other generation. And we've thought a lot about why that is. And I do think young people know that they need to work with older adults, with adults who are have experience, seats of power, in order to have their issues heard. And I think there's a lot that young people can and should learn from older generations. And then we're increasingly hearing from older adults that they feel like there are things that they can and should learn from younger people. And I'm curious and eager to get to conversations in the next panel, as well as just from your perspective about what can be learned within and across the LGBTQ community, where there's been both a real siloing of generations, but also real forcing function where these two pieces can really connect and strengthen each other. So yeah, I think that's a long answer to your question, but I think it's the right question. Mm-hmm.
So we're providing some context here, and so let's talk a little bit about the moment that we're in terms of context, right? It's a truism now. We hear it all the time. We live it. That we're living in extraordinarily polarized times, so much othering, so much separation, and some of that is understood often and described as a backlash to changing demographics in the country. The fact that by 2045, non-Hispanic whites will be a minority of the population of this country. Sometimes it's talked about and understood as a consequence of politicians who choose for their different reasons to pit folks against each other and encourage division. Sometimes we think about it in terms of some of the outcomes of COVID and the trauma and the challenges that we've not fully been able to move beyond. Whatever the different reasons, we seem to be living in this time where this fractiousness is so deeply embedded and can create a notion that it's just not a time when it's possible to make progress on important social issues. And here now, we're talking about intergenerational strategies, building ties across generations, the challenges of ageism. How does that fit, do you think, in the time in which we're living? And is building intergenerational ties, is that one more of those important social goals that we're just not going to be able to get to because our fractiousness is so embedded? Or is there an opportunity here?
Yeah, it won't surprise anybody in this audience that I think it's an opportunity. But I feel like ageism actually is, given how pernicious it is in our society, and not just as something in our minds, but kind of structurally, we've built to allow that to proliferate because of age segregation. If you don't see or know somebody who is of a different generation, if you're not given an opportunity to learn alongside them, let alone to address community problems together, we're kind of in a situation where all you can do is other the other generation because we don't have deep personal relationships. At some level, the uniqueness of our differences across age is that they're not actually separate categories. I've often heard people say that ageism is an unnatural bias towards our future selves. That can't be said for a lot of the other isms, where there's more of a binary on like, where are you situated in the world? I actually think that intergenerational connection collaboration is one important way where we're wired to connect across generations, biologically, evolutionarily. When we are together with somebody of a different generation, there's a part that still feels natural and can cut across a lot of differences. And as we do that, we're actually practicing and exercising the capacity to hold difference. And so I think it's actually an important lever for addressing a lot of the other, a lot of the really contentious differences in society. There's some research that came out with the Belonging Index maybe a year and a half ago that showed declining sense of belonging in America. One little stat that was interesting to me was where it said that when people become friends across a major line of difference, they actually feel a greater sense of belonging. And I think that's in some ways because when somebody who's very different than you says, I like you, let's hang out, in your mind you think, man, the only reason they must want to be with me, because we don't have much in common, is that I'm an amazing person, that I actually belong here. And I think there are ways in which if we lean into our natural inclination to want to connect across generations, practice being in a space where like, oh, but we're actually quite different from one another, but then create that sense of belonging, that can kind of unlock that behavior in other areas as well. So I think we have a unique opportunity right now, and actually not a huge window. I think I said at the beginning that we're the most age-diverse society we've ever been. That's not going to stay that way. In another 10, 15 years, we will become a more old than young society. That means right now I think we have a good 10 years where if we all leaned into practicing intergenerational connection and collaboration, we could reset the behaviors we have in society so that as we become more old than young, there isn't actually in some ways like a backlash where we start to silo ourselves even more for a dominant majority. This moment for older people to learn how to work robustly with young people and vice versa is, I think, part of the solution to a healthy and vibrant society going forward.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that, because whenever there's a reason to be hopeful about the time we're in, that's a great thing. So in the last bit of our conversation, as we segue to the panel, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that's really interesting when it comes to the LGBTQ plus aging experiences is, historically as an organization in our work, SAGE has talked a lot about how LGBTQ plus aging is different, right? That we're much less likely to be parents and therefore to have adult children as we age, right? That we're much more likely to grow old single and living alone, that we're much more likely to grow old disconnected from our families of origin. And we've come up with, as a community, strategies, right, to address those issues. But interestingly, it's seeming as though increasingly the aging experience of many other people is evolving in ways that starts to look more like how the LGBTQ plus experience has been different, right? So more and more people are choosing not to be parents. More and more people are choosing not to marry. Families are smaller, they're more dispersed, right? And so they're less able to provide the kind of support structures that have existed. And so this question of difference and opportunity and place for learning, it feels like it's an evolving one. And in some ways, it feels to me like there's a generational component involved there too. I think about the fact that for my husband and I, in some ways, there's tremendous connective tissue between us and, say, our nephews and nieces, most of whom are straight, because their lives increasingly look a lot more like our lives in terms of some of the choices they're making. It's a lot more like our lives than, say, like their parents' lives, right? And so I wanted to ask you, as we transition to the panel, are there things that can be learned across communities and from the LGBTQ plus experience in aging, and what might be some of the things for the panel to think about in terms of the opportunities there?
Yeah, I think this is a great question to end on. I think I actually think this is a moment where society has the most to learn from the LGBTQ community. As you said, in some ways, unfortunately, because the LGBTQ community has been forced to create kind of fictive kin, to create family that wasn't blood related, including across generational lines, because of not having the ability to marry, to have kids, to build that sort of intergenerational, natural, extended family dynamic. There's a lot to learn. Some of the most dynamic innovations we've seen out there have been around LGBTQ communities co-locating, programs for young people with elders, addressing dual at the same time issues of social isolation, loneliness, limited assets and space, and building and resources, and bringing those two together. There are really interesting intergenerational dialogue projects happening right now where older LGBTQ members of society have fought for so many of the rights. Young people, some don't know the history. Some feel really like they don't even know the access point in. In the research, the Newark University of Chicago report we did, young people, 2 times higher than older people, said, we are nervous about having conversations with older people. We're anxious that we don't know how to communicate with them. Being able to bring people together to have just those basic conversations and exercising those skills is so important. I think we can learn from the LGBTQ community on that as well. And I'll say the final piece is, as older and younger come together, we've done a lot of work into what young people do and don't want from older allies, and a bookend report that we're going to be doing on what older adults do and don't want from their younger allies. Once again, the LGBTQ community is one in which we can learn a lot from that. But some of the basic things that have been said are older and younger want to actually share in a vision for the future. They want to collaborate on having shared power, different assets brought to the table. One thing that we love to talk about is co-generational leadership. The fact that young people are saying, I can't wait 20 or 30 years to be given a seat at the table. Who knows where the world will be at that time? And things are moving so quickly that they need to be able to move into that world. So when it comes to advocacy, how might we get young people to the table with older folks and saying we have a shared future, we have shared interests? And once again, thinking about the fact that olders are just younger people at a different place on the timeline, to actually say, as young people work closely with older folks, they're learning how to become the elders that they need to be. And so I think this is the perfect backdrop for having that conversation and learning from practitioners who are doing this work on the ground. And we should all just be students at their feet. Yeah.
Fantastic, Eunice. Thank you so much for this. And with that, I want to turn it over to Ken and the panel. Thank you, Eunice.
We're good? Okay. Well, thank you, Michael, Eunice, for that great conversation. It's a hard act to follow, but we'll do our best. And thank you also. I'm excited for this conversation. I'm also excited to actually have my back to the sun. So I want to thank all of you for putting up with these the challenges that the sun having to come up at the same place at the same time every day in an unhelpful fashion. So this is a great opportunity. I'm so excited to have an intergenerational panel together to talk about what I hope is some of the specific challenges that the LGBTQ plus community faces in terms of ageism and the challenges of social isolation. I think one of the things that we love to discuss with the panel is the fact that 25% of LGBTQ plus elders live by themselves, which is a number. We know that older people in general face challenges of social isolation, but it's more significant in the LGBTQ plus community. But also the opportunity of the intergenerational future and how you all see that evolving, and to steal from Eunice, the opportunity to co-create the future. Let me introduce the panel. Excited to be here with three really extraordinary leaders. Giovanna Fisher is the Chief Equity Officer for the Los Angeles LGBT Center, which is the largest such organization in the world. So I'm eager to hear about the center and how it became such a significant player in the community and in the city. She centers her work on teaching and learning the collaborative design of systems and experiences that nurture creativity and support inclusive cultural production. Kylie Madoff is the Senior Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at SAGE. In that role, Kylie creates and manages innovative initiatives and partnerships that serve and empower LGBTQ plus elders. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And Phil Wilson is an internationally renowned HIV/AIDS advocate and activist. He's the founder and former president and CEO of the Black AIDS Institute, a think tank whose mission is to stop the AIDS pandemic in the African American community. Prior to founding the Institute in 1999, Phil served as AIDS coordinator for the city of LA, and that's among other roles, many other roles too numerous to mention here. Thank you all for coming here. I just want to sort of pick up the thread from Michael and Eunice's conversation, because it gave us so much to chew on, both in the sort of the positive opportunities and the challenges. But I want to sort of talk with the differences. Michael mentioned that sort of at SAGE they talk about how the sort of the challenges of the community are the elder communities are different, but maybe they're becoming the same. And I want to ask how you all reflect on that. Does that feel right to you? What is the differences that LGBTQ plus elders face, and what are the commonalities? How should we think about that?
All right, I'm happy
Kylie,
to jump
why
off.
don't you start?
Sounds good.
You have the misfortune of sitting right next to me, so I'm going to turn to you and ask for your thoughts.
Sounds fantastic. So as Michael highlighted in his remarks earlier, some of the challenges faced by the LGBTQ plus elder community are challenges that are faced by elders of any community, but I think they're more acute. We would argue that they're more acute for reasons that Michael highlighted, right? So LGBTQ plus elders are less likely to be married, to have children. There's also the question of being ostracized from families is perhaps more common within the community as well. And then other factors that are really important to highlight are the lack of social support networks engendered by a lifetime experience of discrimination, engendered by perhaps being ostracized at their places of work, within their networks of birth. And so all of these things compound to really intensify potentially, right? This is not a universal experience, but potentially the experience of isolation as experienced by LGBTQ plus elders.
Phil, do you want to pick up on that?
I agree with that in some ways, but what resonated with me a lot was the statement that in some ways the LGBTQ community is kind of ahead of the curve in that we have built institutions and structures with the assumption that we would be alone and would not have the support of children and grandchildren and that kind of traditional structure. And I think that is important and actually helpful, and I agree with Michael that other communities can learn from that experience. I actually have an 89-year-old father, and it's been very interesting to watch the isolation that he's experiencing. We lost my mother about 5 years ago, and I feel like there are institutions in the LGBT community that are available to us that are not as easily available to him.
So for example, what kind of institutions, structures have been built because of the challenges of family or lack thereof in the community?
So I think that there is a historical leaning in on an expectation that in heteronormative aging, that there's a dependence on children and grandchildren to step up. And as children move away, and in our family spread across the country, the proximity is not there. Whereas we have in the LGBTQ context, a deliberate institutional building around the assumption that we aren't going to rely on those. For example, at the center, there's a strong emphasis on intergenerationality, co-housing of younger people with older people. So there's an intentionality around that, because many of us, by necessity, left our families of origin and had to, a lot of our lives are around building those families, those families of choice. So I think that the theoretical risk, around isolation, demographic isolation for older LGBTQ people are higher. I think the manifestation of it at this point in time is different. But I also think, if I can pivot a minute, that one of the things that is really important about this point of time when we talk about LGBTQ plus aging is that we're in a point where it's actually a unique period of time in that those of us who are aging now, we are very much a product of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So many of us live lives without the expectation that we were going to age. I am particularly shocked that literally 45 years ago, a doctor said to me that you should put your affairs in order, that we think that you have 6 months to live. And clearly his calculus was wrong. And so,
Thankfully.
And that's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
But their isolation shows up differently for us in that regard. I have all these photographs all through my house. My nephews call them, the hallway of the dead, because there are all these dead people. So that's a change. The other thing is that I think that there is this notion that I regularly run across, and that is around, we also experience, I think, this post-traumatic stress syndrome that has grown out of that lived experience of aging in the age of such a horrific pandemic. And as a result of that, there are other institutions that have been built in that regard.
So can I ask, as a follow-up to that, something Michael said, you are part of a generation that lost a lot of people along the way, that lived through transformative, in both good and bad ways, times. Does the generation that's coming up understand the transformative nature of what you went through? And is that an issue between generations, that the times now feel different than they did, fortunately, 40 years ago?
That's a great question. And I would say generally not, but it is an opportunity in that what I've discovered is that there's tremendous interest in that. I think that this difficulty that exists with older LGBTQ folks on the following places, in that we were fighting for a world where people did not experience the kind of trauma that we experience based on a homophobic reality. And we've made progress in that. And now we resent young people who don't live in that space.
Right. They have it easy, right?
That's right, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Now, I had an experience where I was at a Pride March not too long ago, and there were these young people who were upset that there were all this political stuff, in the parade. And there was a part of me that was like, how can you possibly be upset about that? And then there was a part of me that said, that was the point, that should be a foreign experience. And so I think that is, so your first question, no, I don't think they're understanding. The opportunity is that I think a lot of older LGBTQ folks don't understand and realize the level of interest of young people about that time and that experience.
So now you get to be the representative of the younger generation.
Great.
Sorry. You kind of set up. Apologies for that. But
it's all good.
Yeah.
I have much to say here. Yeah, I mean, I think my background's in education, and I actually started off as a kindergarten teacher, grappling with these questions in that space, and then kind of moving to the space of being like, okay, if we're really moving the needle on like shifting culture, kind of like making our culture more equitable, making our organizations and our institutions more equitable, we got to address the adults and how they think, but I say that to be that like I'm always thinking through like cultural shifting happens through like learning, through education, and through relationships. And, I think to the point that both of you were making, the LGBT community has had to build a relationship outside of biological family models for so long. It was like it was a means of survival. So I think in that regard, the LGBTQ community, that's in practice already. However, I think there's still this opportunity for like learning and relationship building that needs to happen. Like, I think that's where, if we're thinking about leaving today with like a next step, it's like, how do we really like understand this as learning, as like relationship building and learning, and how do we use the spaces that we have influence over to kind of create opportunities for collective learning. And so I think specifically with like the HIV/AIDS like epidemic and how critical it is, like I still feel that way. I'm like, how are we going to get young people, my peers and younger, I think, to like understand what that means? I think I took classes and understood it. I read, the band played on like as 17-year-old, and I was like, oh. And many people are not having those experiences. And not to say that reading that book is the only way that that's going to happen, but I think what are all the things that we can do, and what are all the spaces that we can create where like engaging with those stories, engaging with people who've lived through that, like happen kind of naturally. And then I think the challenge is like, how do you not force it? Because I think that's something that I've experienced since I've been at the center. We're like, okay, this event's going to be intergenerational. We're going to have young folks. We're going to have seniors. Like, everyone's going to be there. We're going to have these questions. And it's like, if you force it too much, like, it's not going to happen also. Like, sometimes just moving the needle a little bit by just having these folks in the same space without too much of a scripted, dialogue and program, like, the relationships are going to start to forge. The listening is going to start to happen. And that's what we can do, So I think it's like, but I think looking at it through a learning lens, like, and relationship building lens is critical for us to kind of create these spaces where that kind of the reciprocal engagement is happening. And I think we're not doing enough of that, or looking at that intentionally enough.
So let me ask you about that. So you have the world's largest community, what both an extraordinary privilege and challenge.
Yes.
Sort of a found family of immense size. But one of the things that people think about ageism often say, or at least I've heard some people say, is like that ism ranks at the bottom, right? You have a lot of other isms that are more higher ranking in sort of the social metrics, and probably more critical to society, or seems that way. How do you think about, as the in your role at the center, how do you think about tackling the challenges of ageism? You have lots of other challenges to tackle before it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the subjugation of any human based on any element of an identity is just problematic. So I think that's like, let's assume that.
Yeah.
And I think when we're working from that space, I mean, that's the thing, it's like, so let's look at a whole person and all the elements of their identity, and they're all worthy of consideration. They all like affect who we are. And I think if you're leading with that in a space, any space that you're creating, that's number one. How are we setting the tone there? And then I think allowing for the relationships to form. I think the Culinary Institute at the center is like an example of when that's happening and everybody's engaged. So we have a 300-hour Culinary Institute for our youth and our seniors to participate in, to actually get accredited, placed in an internship, work in the restaurant industry, and then also make meals, prepare meals for our youth and our seniors who are experiencing homelessness and food insecurity. And in the Institute, they're engaged, everyone who's going through that Institute is engaged with the same learning experience, learning how to do the same thing. And when you're spending that much time with people, like, you're just gonna start to see their humanity, And that's where it starts, is like allowing the time to do something shared together and like let the relationships form. And there's listening and there's learning. And it's not to say it's all peachy. Like, there's points of tension, like things that surface from those differences in those conversations when people are cutting things up together, on a Wednesday afternoon, that surface, that are like, okay, but it also is like leaning into those points of tension and being like, okay, here's a conflict, here's a misunderstanding. Let's talk about it. Let's like normalize talking about it. Let's not be scared to have that conversation. And that exists because that space is there, period. That is deliberately inviting in seniors and young people to do something together and learn something together.
So, Kylie, you wrote an article last year for the ASA Generations Journal, and one of the things you said in it was you gave advice for organizations that are looking to establish an intentionally anti-ageist and/or anti-ableist framework into your organization's operation. So, partially what we're talking about here is how do you build a framework for intergenerational dialogue and support? How do you do it? What's the advice?
Absolutely. So I think from my perspective, and this will come as no surprise, so my background, I'm a linguist by way of education. And so I think a really important part of the process, because as you mentioned, Ken.
Did you say linguist?
Yes.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, that was a 1,000 years ago,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yes.
Cool.
So because as you mentioned, ageism really is accurately described, I would say, as one of the last acceptable forms of prejudice. And it's something that works its way into how we speak about age and aging and ourselves and people around us. And so I think a really important part of that process in terms of like building out an explicitly anti-ageist and ableist program is to identify how we talk about age. Like how do we, like what are the words that we use to describe older people, younger people, so on and so forth, right? Just like look at, because it's really almost built into the DNA of our everyday parlance, right? And I think that's where you start. Then once you do that, you figure out, well, what are the, like I would argue, the barriers to access to the services that we're providing, right? So if we're talking specifically around ableism, we want to make sure that the folks that we're looking to kind of partner with are able to access our services as readily as possible. So I think like taking stock of how we're describing how we're describing age and ability is super important. Then like looking at our sort of like the access points to our services and like what are the assumptions that go into how we build out our virtual and physical spaces are also equally as important. And then, as Giovanna was saying, like I think a lot of it is just creating spaces for, like part of it is also like creating spaces for organic kind of partnership and sharing, and not trying to force conversations, but just allowing people of different backgrounds, of different abilities, of different ages to be able to interact and, dare I say, discover the humanity in one another in ways that are not, you know, not overly contrived, as it were. And so I think those are some really important elements to start with, like when you're looking to kind of build out an explicitly anti-ageist or anti-ableist practice in like whatever line of work you might be in.
So Giovanna mentioned the culinary program at the center, which sounds really cool. What are some examples that you've come across of success of helping organizations sort of co-create that future?
Absolutely. And so in terms of like the work internally at Sage, or in terms of like working with outside organizations in terms?
You can answer whatever way you think is the most interesting, but I actually meant outside organizations. But either way is okay with me.
For sure. And so I think for me, because my work is more focused on kind of like the programmatic aspect, like at Sage
Inside.
itself.
Yeah.
So I can speak to that perhaps.
Yeah.
And so
Fantastic.
so some like really like powerful examples, like I'm thinking specifically of our TGMB programming, right? So we have a very large kind of TGMB community in New York City. It's very large, very diverse, but also quite age stratified. So there's not a lot of opportunities for, you know, for example, TGMB youth to be able to really connect with TGMB elders in any sort of like long form, meaningful way. And so we have like various sorts of program, like in-person and virtual programs happening at Sage that like allow those connections to happen. And again, it's not like in a way where it's like, you know, here's us lecturing you about the way life was in the 1980s or 70s or so on and so forth. It's really focused around, you know, here are people who might be born in different decades, and they're connecting around this particular part of their identity. So that's one example that in my experience, like I think that's a really powerful example of bringing a somewhat disjointed community together across like fairly salient sorts of like experiential and age differences.
Yeah. So Phil, can I ask you a similar question, which is examples of success in the community, and maybe you could react to this notion. I mean, I think, you know, Eunice talked about 97% of people believe in the importance of intergenerational relationships. Is that correct? But far less do anything about it. It's sort of like the weather. Everyone complains about, but no one does anything about it. Who's doing things within the community that you admire and you think are bringing generations together?
Well, not to state the obvious, but obviously SAGE and obviously the center are both doing remarkable work
We'll grant them
in that space. I also think that there is expanded work being done in traditional aging institutions, AARP, for example, and some others. But one of the things that, if I can pivot again, that I think,
Phil, I love it when you pivot, so feel free.
The notion around kind of how to build that, I think, is connected to who we are in relationship to the people that we want to work with. And so for older people, I think it's important for us now to think about younger people as, in some ways, the people who we were. I think that is helpful to kind of break down the tension. One of the things that I find really interesting is how slow some of my colleagues are in passing on the mantle because they don't respect young leadership. And yet we forget how young we were when we picked up the mantle. The first organization that I ran, I was 24 years old. And so if I believed at 24 that I could live, and I have a lived experience that actually shows that that's true, why can't I believe that someone who's 24 today, why can't I believe that they can lead? Similarly, the notion that there are lessons that older people can teach to young people, I think is really true. And I think that those conversations should be about how the information that we have can be applied to issues that are happening in the context of their lives. Now, that it should not just be a historic, conversation. That while I might think that there's value in knowing, and I do think there's value in knowing what we lived through in the 80s and the 90s around HIV and AIDS, I think there's greater value in talking about how those lessons that we learn can be applied in a very tense society that we live in today. And if we think about that in that fashion, I think that it is easier to create the code because we're talking about added value on both ends.
So, Abigail, you just gave me a 5 signal. Is that 5 till the end of the program or 5 till we have questions? So, okay. Well, why don't we take some questions now, and that won't be the end of it. But love to get, I've had the privilege of asking this extraordinary panel questions. Love to give people in the audience the chance to ask questions if you want. Any volunteers? There's one. Yes. Yes, sir.
I'm happy to jump in. So
You're the linguist, so you got it.
my secret's out now.
Yeah.
But like I was going to say, I do think that though that difference in sort of like identity and how people identify definitely does come up a lot in our intergenerational work. I do think that, if like I'll say that there are opportunities for kind of like learning and growth, but also opportunities for tension potentially when, people might not necessarily feel like their identity is being kind of respected by people who might be co-attending an event with them or co-participating in some event. And so it does come up, but I think that, again, when you're able to interact with people of different generations or people who might use language differently than you, I think that's how you kind of work past that potential for tension or stepping on toes. It's like, okay, perhaps, I'm from a generation that doesn't understand community X as well because it wasn't a label that was particularly widely used in decades past. But the more I interact with members of community X, the more I'm probably going to, understand the understanding, but not that it becomes less important, but it becomes more intuitive. It's like, oh, they're just another human being like me. And so I think that's how we approach it at Sage. And also, of course, there are like workshops in terms of different identities, but I really would defer back to like the organic sort of interaction model to help kind of smooth over those like differences in identity and help different people from different like generations familiarize themselves with the way that people might have thought of themselves or think of themselves currently.
Great question.
I mean, I'm curious about having these like learning spaces that aren't about necessarily ageism, but in that you're addressing age and you're introducing yourself with pronouns, and then you're making it a practice where everybody who's in that space across generations is introducing themselves with pronouns. And so someone has to try it on, even if they haven't done it for the first time, because that's like the common practice in that room, and then we're learning about this thing. And so this like shared learning piece is really interesting because it's like everyone's working then with the same content. If even just for that hour and a half you're in a room together, here's this new thing we have. Let's talk about it. Let's engage with it. I think we approached like our equity orientations at the center as like creating the shared language to talk about equity. So we introduced our framework and then used that to talk about equity and how the center has done it well and what ways are we really not serving our community in these ways and ourselves as a staff, and so we introduced the framework and then that became this shared language, and in that you can start to exercise some of these like practices, start to talk about pronouns, give people the safe space to talk about many things. And so yes, was the conversation explicitly about ageism or about racism? No, but in that something starts to emerge and you kind of like create the space that's safe to talk about things in the future. And so the idea is like now that we've started to talk about that and we have this language, now we can be more, I think, specific about what kind of workshops or conversations we want to have. The foundation's laid. We've all kind of received that same information that wasn't specific or rooted in anybody's identity specifically, and that's very much like a pedagogical approach, like a curricular approach to like how learning happens is like adults have to feel safe to learn, and I think that's something that's like sounds kind of basic. When we think about children, we're like, duh, of course they have to feel safe and emotionally safe in a space to learn. But also what we're asking in these intergenerational spaces is like for us to recognize ourselves as like learning, still evolving, growing humans, regardless of what age you are, then you have to create the conditions for that to be okay. And like, I think that's the question. How do you create the conditions for like the learning to be okay? Because that's required if we're really trying to like change how we think about each other and how we like are open to relating to one another and working together. Yeah.
I think that the question around language also is rooted in how we think about progress. I'm of a generation, I was in the room when we created National Coming Out Day. And that was because we needed to call it out because the visibility was important for our society. I also often talk about unless we are explicitly included, we are implicitly excluded. But if you take it from a different point of view, that if your baseline, if you begin with assumption of mutual humanity, then maybe the identity calling out is not as important, and so it depends on where we are in that regard. And so if we have a generation of people who start at a place of greater respect for differences and an understanding of our universal humanity, then the kind of demarcations that were so important to us 40 years ago may not be as important today. And so I think that as linguistically we change, it is also about reflecting actual literal progress that has been made in the march toward a more equitable and a more just society.
I mean, I'm a big just believer in the arts and the creative space generally, and not just for a practicing painter or an artist, but just, and one of my favorite examples, actually, I talked about this on our call, of intergenerational space is in New York. It's this party that's public and free in a park called Soul Summit, and it's house music. And when I first got to New York when I was, I was 20, and I just happened to stumble upon it on a Sunday. And I was like, I have never seen a space that's more diverse, that's more inclusive, that felt more just I'm welcome here. So many people are clearly welcome here than that space. And you have to break it down. If somebody doesn't want to dance to house music, that's fine. But what are the elements that led to that feeling? And I think it's whether it's culinary arts or whether it's dance, that's one of the elements. It's this thing that we're all doing together that culinary arts, eventually you're acquiring a skill, but you're not coming into the space being I'm skilled, I have more skill than you. You're coming into the space. In New York, it was public space. It was free. It was accessible. People could all get there. The weather was nice, And I think really thinking about what are the elements to these things, that allow it to feel, my language would feel really free. It felt like a really liberated space. And how do we apply those elements as building blocks to create more of those spaces around a different thing? So call it going to a museum and having a guided tour, painting. At our senior center, we have so many. There's a jam band, and there's all these offerings. There's a jam band, there's, chair yoga, there's all these movement classes, and there's all these offerings. So it's kind of choose your own adventure, choose what feels good for you. Granted, those spaces are in the senior center, so they're not explicitly intergenerational. The culinary program is. But it is interesting to think about kind of what is in the domain of creativity and how did that become the centerpiece, and then how do we take kind of all those elements and see what happens when multiple people of all ages, of multiple genders and races kind of then can access that.
I think that creativity is critically important. These days, I focus most of my attention in an organization that I founded called Artists and Activists for Health Equity. And our primary focus is around the discipline of dance. We sponsor an annual dance festival that's multicultural and multi-genre, that includes every facet of dance that is imaginable. And so it allows intergenerational space because we do hip hop, we do salsa, we do classical ballet, we do modern ballet, we do Bollywood, we do aerial, we do the whole spectrum of dance styles and systems, and kind of experiencing it in that way. So I agree with you around the importance of creativity and the arts, and being able to communicate through creativity and arts can really bridge the distance between generations, and culture and class and demographics of all sorts.
And I'm happy to just round off this conversation around creativity, because I think it really is, as you were saying, a powerful way of bridging generational gaps, because when one is creating, it allows the opportunity to kind of demonstrate one's mastery in a particular discipline, or one's penchant for something, one's talent, and and because I think a lot of what ageism is the assumption of incompetence or, lack of ability, right? That's what ageism and ableism are, like ascribing values and assumptions that aren't necessarily rooted in reality. And so I think when you're in a space where you're co-creating with people across different abilities, across different age groups, it's really powerful, because it's an opportunity to, even to demonstrate talents that one might not know that they themselves possess, right? Like, oh, this person is really apparently very good, like working with shading, right? Like charcoal, on paper, or, they're able to kind of learn choreography very well, or like whatever the art form is. I think it's a really sort of kind of like way to kind of like work past certain assumptions and certain forms of defensiveness, like I would say as well.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, just one more on that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's like also the creativity unlocks creative thinking, and creative thinking is kind of applied outside of the arts. So I do think it like pushes us to think a little more expansively about anything, not just the arts. So about our relationship to this person, about why institutions look this way, and do they need to look this way, and like what is another solution, and like thinking outside of the box. And so I do think as like it is this kind of like, it pushes creative thinking to be applied anywhere, period. And like we need that. And I'd argue the LGBTQ community has really like creatively thought about everything as a means of survival in the society.
Okay. So we'll have to make this the last question. Go ahead. So that's such a good question. I think you've stumped the panel.
I'm a linguist, I'm not a tech person, but I'm going to like think about that. That's a great question.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to keep that as food for thought. And let me just ask one last question. I mean, it's a great example. And you do see, I'm not going to answer on technology, but you do seem a lot more intergenerational recording artists coming together in ways that I think really reflect, respect between different forms of music and different generations. So I think that's really a cool thing. So thank you for bringing that up. Last question and I'm just going to ask each of you sort of in the form of speed round. Eunice mentioned that we're sort of the interesting rectangular period of time when all the we're not an old society, we're not a young society, and that's going to change in 10 years. So with that 10-year frame, and thinking of this sort of as a unique period of opportunity, what would you like to see changed? What do you hope, if we come together in 10 years, which would be great, what do you hope is different in terms of intergenerational respect within the LGBTQ plus community? And I'm just going to ask each of you to sort of speak very briefly to that.
I suppose if I had if I had to choose something off of my wish list.
You have a magic wand.
I have a magic wand. I'm going to turn, I think I would turn younger people into more robust policy advocates, right? Like recognizing that as our society ages, there's going to be very much a need to kind of reconfigure our social safety nets in this country. And so I would, if I could wave my magic wand, I would turn us all into activists to essentially reassign kind of like municipal and federal budgets to support those networks.
All right, Phil?
I would say two things quickly. One, I'm curious if in the LGBTQ community, if we are as rectangular as the larger community. Now, I'm curious if we're still at a triangle for different reasons.
Yep.
So that's number one. But number two, I would say that a lot of programming, I may be completely wrong, but it seems to me a lot of programming within the senior space in the LGBTQ arena is really driven on economics. That we are addressing the socioeconomic disparities that happen in our society, but the isolation that happens in our society is not necessarily based on socioeconomic conditions. That the seniors, the housing project at the center is to provide low-income housing and to address the issue of homelessness among seniors. The food program, similarly. But the isolation, I think, among older folks transcends class and economics. And so that we can build a more robust structure around the isolation that happens with older people, regardless of your socioeconomic status.
Okay. And you get the final word.
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. I'll reinvent the question. So Eunice described that we're sort of moment in time that's going to be different 10 years. There's maybe a window of opportunity because of sort of the, at least as a nation as a whole, equal demographic balance between generations. That's going to pass. So what do you hope to have different that might be different in 10 years from now if we have success in bringing the generations together? What's success look like for you?
Yeah, I think success looks like, I think more kind of like arts and cultural spaces that we've leaned into this intergenerational piece in the design of them, and that there's just more shared, pleasurable leisure activities that young people and older folks, folks across ages are accessing because they're interested in it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. What a great panel. Thank you all. Thank you for this. I want to thank also the David Bohnett Foundation and, of course, the Wallis Annenberg Legacy Foundation for supporting this event. There's still food, if people want to get together and talk, there's still, I think, food and refreshments out there. And then there's going to be a tour for those who are interested, as Aradhana mentioned, of Gen Space, which is an extraordinary space right above us. I think it's 95 steps up, if I read the markings on the steps correctly. There's a tour guide who's going to meet us in the lobby if you want to take that tour for 15, 20 minutes. I want to thank the team at SAGE for pulling this together. What a great group to work with. It's been a privilege. Yeah, give them a hand. And they will be sending you the recording of this event and additional resources. You can always find out more about SAGE at sageusa.org and about the Longevity Project at longevity-project.com. Thank you all for coming today.